welcome. You're watching The Social Network. It's been a weekend packed with technology and related news. Of course, the news of those two big tech giants, iPhone and BlackBerry, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But back home, first, we need to talk about Aadhaar. Now, yesterday, of course, the Supreme Court gave an interim order. And of course, the crucial order basically challenges the whole premise of that ambitious project of the government, the UID or the Aadhaar scheme. We'll quickly take a look at that topic before we bring you all the news on those two big tech giants. Talking to us a little bit about that today, we're joined in the studio by Jiten. He's the founder of, he's co-founder of Catalyst, which is a government policy research firm. And we're also joined in the studio by Aparna Chandra, who is an assistant professor of the National Law University. And we'll also be joined in just a bit by Neville Roy Singham, who is the founder of ThoughtWorks. It's an IT firm based out of Chicago. We'll be talking to him in just a bit. But first, I quickly want to ask you, Jaji, you know, of course, this is an interim order, but it's a fairly crippling order for the government. It challenges the whole basis of the scheme of Aadhaar. What do you make of it?
You know, Aadhaar faces this chicken and egg problem in the sense that unless 100% of the citizens have Aadhaar, you can't make it mandatory to be used for providing government services and public services, because you can't be excluding people. On the other hand, if you do not have 100% of the people having this card, and if you don't make it mandatory, then people will not go for this card. So you will never have everybody having the Aadhaar number. And if everyone in this 1.2 billion people do not have the Aadhaar number, then the country becomes very difficult to govern. You need to use technology to reach out to people and to have directed subsidies and directed benefits being given, so that it doesn't go to the segments in the population who do not need these benefits and segments. But you can't do that unless everybody has the Aadhaar card and unless you make something mandatory. Now, there are issues in terms of the legislative framework not being strengthened enough to provide the support that Aadhaar needs, and therefore you need to make the legislative frameworks much more stronger. But that does not mean that we cannot and should not have Aadhaar. It's a process. Aadhaar is a huge journey. It's a very challenging project. It's a project of a dimension that has not been seen anywhere else in the world. In the history of mankind, we're trying to track 1.2 billion people. It has never happened. So obviously, it will go through these issues.
You know, one of the grounds that the petitioner actually challenged the Aadhaar was, in fact, on the basis of privacy. But let's actually also bring in Usha Ramanathan, who's one of the fiercest critics of that Aadhaar scheme. Let's have a look at what she's said.
UID is appearing to be a big scam, and I don't agree that it should be Aadhaar card should be made mandatory for all the public services like government has been making, even for gas connections or something. And I think the way Aadhaar cards were being issued to the migrants and, you know, even to the objects like tables and spoons, I think Supreme Court has done the right thing by declaring it that it should only be given to the Indian citizens and no one else, and it cannot be made mandatory for, you know, using public services.
What the Supreme Court said yesterday was that you cannot make UID mandatory for accessing any services. Now, throughout, the government had been trying to say that no, it's actually voluntary, because people have to voluntarily come and give their consent to enrolling for a UID. But they were using, you know, it's like the right hand was pretending that they didn't know what the left hand did. And they were saying that, okay, we're going to make it mandatory in all kinds of things. You can't get gas, you can't get rations, you can't get your salary, you can't get anything. You can't get married, you can't get into a rental agreement unless you have a UID number. And that was where the mandatoriness was being slipped in, actually quite blatantly. And that's what the Supreme Court has now said it cannot continue to do. As for the poor, you know, what will it do to the identity of the poor? I think it's important to remember that this is not an identity that is being given to the people. It is a means of identification of the poor. So a simple thing like whether UID is a number or a card or what, even ministers haven't known till very recently. The poor have no idea what is being done with it. I think it's important to remember that, and we can't treat the poor like a subject race. I think we need to be really careful how we are going to treat the poor in a context like this.
All right, so those are some of the criticisms that have come in. Jaji, you know, I mean, one of the things that's been talked about a lot is the fact that, you know, this whole angle of privacy. Is that something that is a very elitist kind of an argument, doesn't really apply to the poor who perhaps need their welfare benefits and they need them on time and they need them better? And that's one of the arguments that's always been made in support of the Aadhaar, for example.
Yeah, you know, there may be views that the privacy requirements of the underprivileged is slightly lower given the kind of requirements they need in terms of support. But having said that, or having heard those views, what one should keep in mind that even the poor have got very strong privacy requirements. What if their data is compromised and they are then excluded from benefits that the government gives, or excluded from, let's say, the voter list, right? They can be excluded from the very basis from which they're deriving their power, which is their ability to exercise their voting rights, right? So they do have privacy rights which we need to respect. As a democracy, we need to make sure that they have the privacy rights which enables them to go ahead and leverage that.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the things that came up in court, that slowly it seems the state governments, including Maharashtra and Delhi and even parts of Madhya Pradesh, are in fact linking all the benefits to the Aadhaar card in a way that it's making it mandatory. Aparna, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think there are a few problems here. One is the reliance on biometrics, right? There's an assumption that by relying on biometrics, we can actually provide a unique identification number. The problem is a person's biometrics need not necessarily stay constant throughout, right? So if you're a manual laborer, for example, you might not have your fingerprints, you get cataract. So there's a problem with relying on biometrics for identity. Now the problem comes in, there are two additional problems. One is the problem of privacy. We don't have a statutory framework. We have no guarantee yet that this data is actually going to be protected. And there can be very serious consequences, as Jaydeep pointed out, of compromise. The third point is about exclusion, right? The court also mentions the point about illegal migrants. So you raised that issue. But also, if you lose that identity, if you lose that means of identification, or if you can't get it because you can't show citizenship suddenly, and huge swaths of this country have no proof of citizenship, then if it becomes mandatory, this becomes a huge ground for exclusion. So Aadhaar actually ends up doing the opposite of what it's intended for. It's intended to give benefits. It's going to be a ground for exclusion.